is enmity with God. Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think that the scripture says in vain, the Spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously? But he gives more grace. Therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore submit to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament and mourn and weep, and let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. Obviously, especially the end there, I think we know that line and we know that verse, a very famous passage in James, but I think it's a hallmark to our faith that humility and having a humble relationship with God is the key to our spiritual success. And maybe we don't talk about it enough. And I think maybe sometimes I get in a habit where I want to talk about specific sins. I want to talk about salvation. I want to talk about specific practices we do. And we're going to continue to do that. Those are important things to do. But what's the key? What is the one thing you could tell someone that you know if they will apply it, they will for sure go to heaven, basically? That they will be sure to have a relationship with God and they will be spiritually successful. One thing we could say to that is, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, your mind. That would be a good answer for that. But I think another one that's is equally as important is humble yourself in the sight of the Lord and he will lift you up. That is an over-encompassing thought and attitude that would make us all be spiritually successful. That we would know we would have a home in heaven and we would know that we'd have a relationship with God. Now, this is what he's telling to Christians. If you notice back in verse 4, he says adulterers and adulteresses. Why are these Christians called adulterers and adulteresses? Well, they are cheating on God with the world, right? That's what the thought is. You're cheating on God with the world. You love the world. You're going back into the world. But there's a solution. And that solution is that the Spirit who dwells in you yearns jealousy for you. That's in verse 5. The thought that is here, and I'm a visual thinker, I think of it this way, that you have the world and you have God. And God sees people who were once his that have gone back into the world. And he becomes jealous for those people. That's what's happening here in James 4. That these people have gone back into the world. They love the world. They love the pleasures of the world. And now God looks over and he sees them over in the world side and he becomes jealous for them with that godly jealousy. So what God does is he begins to do some things so he can pull his people out of the world back into himself where they belong. And that's what the rest of the passage is about, right? It says that he gives more grace, verse 6, meaning that God can give you more good things than the world could ever offer you. And what he does to do is he tries to show that to his people. Hey, look, you are so much better off with me that those people will submit to him and come back to him. And what we have in the next section, especially verse 6, God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble, I think makes this point very clear. That there's two different types of people in the world. And I think especially in this context, we can say there's two different types of people that hold the name of Christian, where both of these groups of these people call themselves Christians, but one group may necessarily not be truly Christians. And that is the two groups of there's prideful people and there's humble people. And those are the Christians that are over there in the world that God's trying to pull back in. The thing is here is, look on verse 6, there's only one group he's going to pull back. He's going to resist the prideful, but he's going to give grace to the humble, right? Meaning those humble people are going to eventually leave the world. They're going to come back to God. And because of that, God is going to reward them with grace. He's going to give them things they don't deserve. He's going to forgive them of their sins. He's going to re-enter them in that covenant with him through his son's blood. Those people are going to receive grace. Now, this is the tricky part. These prideful people often want to come back. And that's simply because they see the blessings that Christians have in God. They see those things. And you have prideful people that once have been baptized for remission of sins, but they've gone back into the world, and they look over there and they say, but you know what? I want those things too. Mainly, I think one is, I want life after death. I want to go to heaven. Maybe it's, I want to be part of that church, and I want to be friends with those people again. Maybe is, you know what? I was just happy there. I enjoyed being part of that group, and I want to go back, and I'm going to go join this local church again. All these little different blessings that come from being part of God. And they want to come back. So they try to come back. And maybe they come back to a church building at least. But what does God do to those people? It says God resists them, right? God resists the prideful, but he gives grace to the humble. That's what happens in that situation. Those people never end up actually back. God butt heads with them. He fights them about that because of their attitude, right? So the question is what can the prideful do? You know, because they're being resisted into entering back into God. Well, thankfully, James tells us what the prideful can do, which is verse 7. Therefore, submit to God, right? They have to become humble. They have to change their attitude so God will accept them back and give them grace instead of resisting them. A prideful person has to become a humble person to be able to come back to God. They have to submit to God, right? Verse 7. They're going to have to mourn and lament and weep. They're going to have to repent and purify themselves to be able to humbly come back to God. And that's the solution. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up, say to these prideful people who used to live as Christians. Now, what is the key to spiritual success then? James has made this point to us, but what's the key? And I'm not asking what's a good spiritual thing to do. I'm not asking what's a good spiritual thing to hope to achieve. I'm asking what's the key to success. If you get this one thing right, you get this one key right, everything else will fall into place. The key to spiritual success is not perfectly performing the law of faith. That isn't the key to spiritual success. That we perform the commandments God has given us flawlessly. Now, I think maybe in the past we've taught that. But that is not the key to spiritual success. The key to spiritual success is also not a high level of biblical knowledge. Well, I just need to become extremely knowledgeable in everything God ever had to say, and that will help me get back to God, and I'll be able to be saved that way. A lot of people have put their trust in that, and the fact is, there's a lot of people out there that are much smarter about the Bible than we are, and they are not part of the kingdom of heaven. And it's because that's not the solution to spiritual success. The key is also not doing more good works than bad works. Sadly, there are many Christians that believe in this Hindu karma system as Christians, where they believe that on Judgment Day, Jesus is going to weigh their good works with their bad works, and if they have more good works, well, then they're going to be saved. But the Bible doesn't teach that. Actually, a false religion is the one that teaches that. That's where we got that from. That's not the key to spiritual success. What's the key to spiritual success? Well, James told us, it's humbling yourself in the sight of the Lord. That's the key to spiritual success. Because the person who humbles themselves, they're going to do these things. They're going to do good works, aren't they? They're going to study the Bible and learn everything that they can. They're going to seek God in that way. They're going to seek the law of faith. They're going to love the law, like we read about in the Psalms. The humble person reaches for all those things, but he doesn't put his trust in those things. He puts his trust in God's grace, in his humility to accept God's grace. We understand the principle, but let's talk about this. What does this look like in real life? What does humbling yourself in the sight of the Lord really look like? I think sometimes in my mind, I picture somebody falling on their knees or crying or weeping and wailing. And certainly those things would be what people were doing if they were really in mourning and that sort of thing. Those things are fine to do. But what I'm talking about is practical humbleness. When do we really see it? When does it really help us? Let's look at those two different people again. Our prideful Christians and our humble Christians. If a prideful person goes out into the world, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to fall into some type of sin or multiple sins, and they're going to be loaded down with that. When a brother or sister sees that that brother has fallen into sin, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to go probably try to approach them about that. When they approached them about that and they talked to them about that, what does that prideful person do? Well, they get angry and they get mad and they try to get rid of that person, right? That's not a humble person, right? What if they still come to worship? Maybe they still go to a church building at least, and they show up and be part of those activities. Are they going to come? Are they going to enjoy that? No, they're going to be miserable. And they're going to hate what the preacher has to say. They're going to hate what the Bible class teacher has to say. They're not going to like anybody's comments. And maybe you go and greet them, and they're not even going to like that. Because they're prideful people. They don't even want to be here. They like their way, and they think their way's best, and they're not going to enjoy anything that we do for God in that manner. I think we see that type of person in verse 1. Look at James 4:1. Where do wars and fights come from among you? That's the church. Do they not come from your desires of pleasure that war with your members? And he talks about you lust and you do not have, and so you fight and you quarrel. Where do fights and wars come from amongst brethren? Would I suggest to you that they come from prideful brethren? If you want to call them brethren, they come from prideful people. And they're the ones that start the fights and the wars because it's the only thing they got to live for. Why does that prideful person have such a miserable existence even though they want God's blessings? The answer, James told us. God resists the prideful person, right? God butts heads with them. He stops them. And until they humble themselves, they're going to be miserable people trying to live in God's kingdom because God resists the prideful. Let's also look at the humble brother, though. The humble brother sees the world, enjoys the pleasures of the world, and he goes and he falls into some type of sin. A brother comes and tells the other brother, hey, I think you've fallen into something. I need to get you out of this. Does that humble brother become angry? No, he becomes remorseful. That humble brother comes back. He comes to worship. Does that humble brother enjoy worship? You bet he does, because he understands what he's been offered, what he's been given. Does the humble worshiper enjoy Bible class? Yes, he's excited about what we have to learn. He's excited to see what new things he can learn about what God wants him to do, right? Does the humble brother enjoy being part of God and God's things? Yes, he does. Why does he enjoy it? Because God gives grace to the humble. He doesn't resist him, does he? The only one who's being resisted there in this context is the devil. That's what they look like in real life, right? And I think obviously it begs the question, are we humble or are we prideful? Because a lot of the problems that we have in this life are caused by our own pride, and God's resistant of that pride. A lot of the solutions we have in this life is because we're humble people before God, and God gives us grace in those things. Let's look at this in an Old Testament context now. Turn to 2 Chronicles 18. I want to share two stories with you from Jehoshaphat. One's a long one and one's a short one. We're going to do the long one first. Jehoshaphat, if you don't know him, is the king of Judah. Long, long time ago. King of Israel was up here. The kingdom was divided. Ahab was the name of the king there in Israel. Ahab is a wicked king. He's brought in Baal worship. He's brought in false idol worship. And he is living in wickedness. One of the worst kings of Israel. Jehoshaphat is trying to make good things in Judah. But Jehoshaphat is asked to make an alliance with Ahab when Ahab is at war with the king of Syria. And so Jehoshaphat comes to meet King Ahab to talk about this alliance. And this is where the story begins. We're going to read this whole section, 1 through 27. So bear with me. Please try your best to pay attention. We'll come back and break it up. 18 verse 1, 2 Chronicles. Jehoshaphat had riches and honor in abundance, and by marriage he allied himself with Ahab. And after some years he went down to visit Ahab in Samaria, and Ahab killed sheep and oxen in abundance for him and the people who were with him, and persuaded him to go up with him to Ramoth-Gilead. And Ahab, king of Israel, said to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, will you go with me against Ramoth-Gilead? And he answered to him, I am as you are, and my people as your people. We will be with you in the war. Also Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, please inquire for the word of the Lord today. And the king of Israel gathered up the prophets together, 400 men, and said to them, shall we go to war against Ramoth-Gilead, or should we refrain? So they said, go up, for God will deliver it into the king's hand. But Jehoshaphat said, is there still not a prophet of the Lord here that we may inquire of him? So the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, there is still one man by whom we may inquire of the Lord, but I hate him, because he never prophesies good concerning me, but always evil. He is Micaiah, the son of Imlah. And Jehoshaphat said, let not the king say such things. The king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, clothed in their robes, sat each on his throne, and they sat at the threshing floor at the entrance of the gate of Samaria, and all the prophets prophesied before them. Now Zedekiah, the son of Chinnerah, had made horns of iron of himself, and he said, thus says the Lord, with these you shall gore the Syrians until they are destroyed. And all the prophets prophesied, saying, go up to Ramoth Gilead and prosper, and the Lord will deliver you into the king's hand. Let's stop for just a minute. What we see here is that Jehoshaphat and Ahab are together, and they're in alliance to go up to war against the king of Syria. And what Jehoshaphat says is, before we go, we need to consult God about this. And so Ahab says, Jehoshaphat, good idea. And he brings in 400 of his prophets. Now, these prophets are probably prophets of Baal. And we get that from other stories. But these prophets come in, and what do they say? They say, God is going to be with you. God is going to help you defeat the Syrians. And you even got one crazy guy that gets on some horns on his head and says, hook 'em horns. We're going to go, and you're going to go defeat the Syrians, so says the Lord. Crazy people. And you can picture Jehoshaphat watching all this stuff, right? And Jehoshaphat looks at Ahab and says, you got anybody who actually can talk to God? And Ahab says, well, I got one. His name's Micaiah, but he never says anything good about me. Jehoshaphat's like, you shouldn't say stuff like that. And so then they sent to go get Micaiah for Jehoshaphat's sake. And this is that story here in verse 12. It says, and the messenger who had gone to call Micaiah spoke to him, saying, now listen, the words of the prophets with one accord encourage the king. Therefore, please let your word be like the word of one of them and speak encouragement. And Micaiah said, as the Lord lives, whatever my God says, that I will speak. Then he came to the king, and the king said to him, Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth Gilead, or should we refrain? And he said, go and prosper, and they shall be delivered into your hand. Now Ahab is shocked. Micaiah, the person who only speaks evil to him, the prophet of the Lord, said, go, and you're going to win? Verse 15. So the king said to him, how many times shall I make you swear that you tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord? Then he said, I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains as sheep with no shepherd. And the Lord said, these have no master. Let each return to his house in peace. Then the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, did I not tell you he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil? Then Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing on his right hand and his left. And the Lord said, who will persuade King Ahab of king of Israel to go up, that he may fall at Ramoth Gilead? So one spoke in this manner, and another spoke in this manner. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, I will persuade him. And the Lord said to him, in what way? So he said, I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets. And the Lord said, you shall persuade him and also prevail. Go out and do so. Therefore, look, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of these prophets of yours, and the Lord has declared disaster against you. Then Zedekiah, the son of Chinnerah, went in here and struck Micaiah on the cheek and said, which way did the spirit from the Lord go from me and speak to you? And Micaiah said, indeed, you shall see on the day when you go into the inner chamber to hide. And the king of Israel said, take Micaiah and return him to Amon, the governor of the city of Joash, the king's son, and say, thus says the king, put this fellow into prison and feed him with bread of affliction and water of affliction until I return in peace. And what does Micaiah say back? Now, he just prophesied that King Ahab was going to die. And he says, go and feed him bread and water until I return back safely. Verse 27, and Micaiah said, if you ever return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me. And he said, take heed, all you people. That's the end of the story. That's the longest reading we're going to do. We're going to stop now. But what's interesting about this story is now that Micaiah has come back, he says, I'm just going to tell you whatever God told me. And as they speak, he tells them that they're going to win the war. But he says, Ahab, you're going to die. And he says, the reason why you're going to die, Ahab, is because God on his heavenly throne, with his other powers around him, They had a conversation about you, Ahab. And what they decided to do was to send you a spirit of delusion, right? We read about that in other places where God said, well, Ahab, if you're going to be evil and wicked in my sight, I'm going to send you to your death. And I'm going to deceive you in this way. And he says, that's what you just saw with all these 400 prophets telling you to go to your death. And that's the story, right? Why is Ahab given the spirit of delusion? Could we suggest that it's because Ahab is a prideful man and God's going to resist him and hereby resisting him through the work of the prophets here? I think that's exactly what we're seeing. Now, Jehoshaphat decides to go. And if we read the next section, we see that they go out to war against the king of Syrians, and lo and behold, King Ahab dies. He's shot by an arrow trying to hide himself, trying to trick the soldiers into chasing Jehoshaphat instead of him. But notice here what's said about Jehoshaphat. It says that he thinks he's about to die. In verse 31, it says, so it was when the captains of the chariot saw Jehoshaphat that they said, it is the king of Israel. Therefore they surrounded him to attack, and Jehoshaphat cried out, and the Lord helped him, and God diverted them from him. Jehoshaphat was saved from this terrible situation. Let's connect the dots. Jehoshaphat was pulled by the world, wasn't he? He was pulled by the world in that he wanted to have an alliance with the wicked King Ahab. He wanted to be buddies with him. He wanted to have a relationship with him, so much so he married into Ahab's family. And even so, when Ahab asked about this alliance, did you see what Jehoshaphat said? He said, my horses are your horses. My people are your people. We're the same people, Ahab. Yes, I'll go with you. What did Jehoshaphat want? He wanted unity with Israel. Do we have the same temptation? We crave unity more than we crave purity. I think Jason talked about this just recently. That's what Jehoshaphat was craving. He wanted to be unified with Israel more than he wanted the purity from Israel's Baal worship. He was pulled by the world, wasn't he? Jehoshaphat was getting pulled strong by the world, so much so that he shows up to Ahab's house in this way. But even after doing those wicked things, God saved him. Now, usually stories follow a certain pattern. You do bad things, and God destroys you. You do good things, and God saves you. This in the Bible, and I can show you in other places as well, does not follow that pattern. Jehoshaphat was making poor choices, and then God saved him. It's the opposite. So why did God save him? Well, I think the answer is clear because we've read James 4. One, Jehoshaphat always wanted to hear what God had to say. And I think right there shows his humility. Even in a bad situation, he wanted a prophet to come and tell him what God had to say. Jehoshaphat, by the way, does this twice. He does it also with Ahab's son. It's the same story, and that time they go get Elisha instead. But Jehoshaphat, even then, wanted to hear what God had to say. Do you know people like that? Do you know weak brethren that always want to hear what God has to say, even if it's going to tell them they're wrong? I do. And thankful for those people, because that's the very thing that why they're given grace, why they're going to work out. He did not consider the advice of the false prophets, did he? 400 men come and tell him what he wants to hear. Go and get him. You're going to be victorious. Does Jehoshaphat listen to those guys? Jehoshaphat is able to tell the difference between people who just tell him what he wants to hear and people that are going to tell him the truth. And that is a good skill that every Christian should have. To be able to take a moment for a second and say, well, wait, am I just being told what I want to hear, or am I being told the truth? Do I believe this because I just want to believe this, or because I believe it's the truth, and that's why I believe it? And that attribute here is why he is saved, right? Finally here, he knows how to take a rebuking. He's rebuked for all this back in chapter 19. Look at chapter 19 real quick, just one verse. Well, let me read 3 verses. I'm going to take more than I'm going to ask. Then Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, returned safely in the house of Jerusalem. And Jehu, the son of Hananiah, the seer, went out to meet him and said to King Jehoshaphat, should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? Therefore the wrath of the Lord is upon you. Nevertheless, good things are found in you, that you have removed the wooden images from the land and have prepared your heart to seek God. And it says, so Jehoshaphat went out again, and the rest of the chapter is Jehoshaphat's reforms in Judah, trying to pull the people back to the Lord. The prophet comes to Jehoshaphat and says, hey, you did wrong. You made an alliance with evil. You have loved those who hate God. He says, however, there's some good things about you. And I think key here is that the line, you have prepared your heart to seek God. What does that mean? That means Jehoshaphat has his heart where it can be malleable and it can be molded by God. That's where he keeps his heart. That he is willing always to make changes if God says so. What type of person is that? Well, that's a humble person. And that's how he's prepared his heart to see God. Let's look at one more story. This is a short one. It's 3 verses. Look at chapter 30. Don't go to chapter there. Chapter 20. Same book. Look at verse 35. This is about the end of Jehoshaphat's life. Verse 35, we meet Ahaziah. This is Ahab's son. Verse 35 says, after this, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, allied himself with Ahaziah, king of Israel, and acted very wickedly. He acted very wickedly. This is a story we've already seen before. 36, and he allied himself with to make ships to go to Tarshish, and they made the ships in Ezion-Geber. But Eliezer, the son of Dova of Marish, prophesied against Jehoshaphat, saying, because you have allied yourself with Ahaziah, the Lord has destroyed your works. Then the ships were wrecked, so they were not able to go to Tarshish. Jehoshaphat gives into the same mess he's already getting into. We didn't read him but 3 times. He makes an alliance with a wicked king. He makes these ships, and they're going to work together to send these ships to go get gold. And God comes in and destroys them. And then God just notifies him, hey, go tell Jehoshaphat that I killed his ships. I broke them. And that's the end of the story. Kings tells us more of the story. Verse 48, Jehoshaphat made merchant ships to go to Ophir for gold, but they never sailed, for the ships were wrecked at Ezion-Geber. Then Uzziah, the son of Ahab, said to Jehoshaphat, let my servants go with your servants in the ships. But Jehoshaphat would not. I love this story because he tries to do something wicked, but God stops him. He just blows up his ships. It seems that King Uzziah comes back to Jehoshaphat and says, hey, let's try again. But what does it say about Jehoshaphat? It said that he would not. Why would Jehoshaphat not go the second time? Because he listened to God. I mean, that's the answer. It's very simple. God intervened, God acted, and he listened to him. He said, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. And that's the end of the story. And it just ends abruptly like that. Jehoshaphat here was given an opportunity to be better. We don't see him fussing at God about breaking his ships. We don't see him arguing with God about what he did and all this business. It just says that he would not do it again. That's because he took this opportunity to humble himself and make a correction. Because that's the type of person Jehoshaphat is. At the very end of this story, after Jehoshaphat's dead and gone, 2 Chronicles 22:9, the book says that Jehoshaphat, who sought the Lord with all his heart. That's what's said about Jehoshaphat after he was dead and gone. Why would God say something like that about Jehoshaphat? You ever thought about that? Who sought the Lord with all his heart. Did Jehoshaphat seek the Lord with all his heart? Because I can tell you some bad things that Jehoshaphat did throughout his life. How can we say that about a man who had so many weaknesses? Every alliance he was offered, it seems like he took. Every time the world pulled on him, he failed. How can we say that about somebody who sought the Lord with all his heart? What's the answer? Because he gives grace to the humble. That's the answer. You can have a man who has all the weaknesses in the world, but if he'll humble himself before God, God will give him grace. You can have a man who falls prey to the world every day. But if he'll humble himself and he'll make corrections where he needs to and he'll listen to God and he continues to work with God, what will God say about him? He'll say, oh, you sought me with all your heart. You know what this does? It gives me a lot of hope that if Jehoshaphat can make so many mistakes, but be willing to humble himself before God, God will give him grace. That says to me that I think I'm probably a lot better than Jehoshaphat. But all I really need to do is keep my humility in check, because I know God gives grace to the humble. What's the key to your spiritual success? How are you going to be able to go to heaven? It's only going to be because God gives grace to the humble. That's the type of heart that he can work with. That's the type of heart that he can mold. And that is the only type of heart that he will accept. There's another part about James 4 that we didn't talk about. It's the second time the word resist is used. God resists the prideful, but for the humble heart that submits to God, they resist the devil. If you can put yourself in the devil's shoes, I know that's a terrible place to be, but if you can put yourself in the devil's shoes, what would be the one thing you would try to do to get brethren out of the church? If I was Satan, all I would have to do is try to keep them prideful. What's the one thing Satan would need to do to keep brethren from coming back to the church? All he would have to do is make sure they don't get humble. Check yourself. Watch yourself. Because very well those things that you think so mightily and highly about yourself are probably coming from Satan himself. But the things that are coming about humility, those things are coming from God. If you would like to hear the voice and obey the voice of God today, and if we can assist you in that, please come forward as you stand and sing.
I'm satisfied with just a cause below, a little silver.